Imagine standing in a crowded market square, the summer air thick with the stench of sweat, incense, and fear. A wooden frame stands at the center, waiting, not for a quick death, but for something far worse. Here, the condemned will not be granted mercy in a single stroke. Piece by piece, their body will be unmade, and the crowd will watch every moment. For over 1,000 years in imperial China, this was the ultimate punishment. A slow-motion execution so calculated, so methodical, it was said the soul itself could not escape until the final cut. The market square is overflowing. Children perched on their father's shoulders. Merchants pushing carts heavy with roasted chestnuts and sugared plums. And at the center, a wooden frame built not to hold goods, but to hold a man perfectly still while he is dismantled piece by piece. This is not a sudden beheading or a clean hanging. This is Ling Chi, the slow process, the lingering death by 1,000 cuts. It is not merely an execution. It is an event, one that serves as theater, lesson, and terror all at once. For over a millennium in imperial China, Ling Chi was reserved for only the gravest of crimes. Treason, rebellion, the murder of one's own parents, or certain forms of sorcery. In the hierarchy of punishment, it was the ultimate end. The point was never speed, it was control. The condemned was kept alive for as long as possible, the agony drawn out over hours, sometimes even days, until death arrived as an afterthought. In a society built on rigid obedience and cosmic order, Ling Chi wasn't just about killing someone. It was about erasing them, physically, spiritually, and socially, in front of as many witnesses as possible. A culture that could watch. To understand Ling Chi, you have to step into a mindset far from modern sensibilities. In Confucian philosophy, harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity depended on everyone fulfilling their assigned role. To defy the emperor, the son of heaven, wasn't just treason. It was an act against the cosmic balance itself. Such a crime demanded punishment on a scale grand enough to restore order. Buddhist ideas about karma and suffering also shaped how these punishments were seen. Many believed that extreme pain could be either the repayment for past sins or a necessary trial before a better rebirth. For the public, watching Ling Chi wasn't only about morbid curiosity. It was witnessing justice on both a worldly and spiritual level. Foreigners were horrified. Jesuit missionaries in the Ming Dynasty recorded detailed, almost nauseated descriptions of these executions. To them, it was barbarity disguised as order. But within China, it was often accepted, even ritualized. The specialists in pain. The men who carried out Ling Chi were not brutes. They were trained, often for years, in a grim discipline that blended anatomy with theater. Known as Dao Buzhong, they could make cuts to inflict maximum pain while striking a vital organ. They worked with razor-sharp blades about 4 inches long. Steel maintained with an obsessive care usually reserved for surgical instruments. Each cut was deliberate. Fingers, toes, ears, nose, extremities first, then muscles, then the face. Small, precise removals, like carving meat from a still-living statue. The condemned was kept hydrated. If they began to fade, stimulants could be administered. Sometimes the executioners paused deliberately, letting the victim's fear rise before continuing. The frame they were bound to was an instrument of both exposure and restraint, hardwood reinforced with iron, fitted with adjustable clamps to immobilize the body in any position. The crowd needed to see everything. The Ming Dynasty stage. The Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, was an era of immense power, prosperity, and paranoia. Emperors ruled as semi-divine figures. Military generals held enormous influence, but were watched carefully. History was filled with dynasties toppled by ambitious commanders, so the court developed a reflexive fear of military power. The law allowed Ling Chi for treason, rebellion, and other cosmic crimes. And treason didn't always mean open war. A letter with the wrong wording, a delay in obeying an imperial order. These could be read as rebellion if political enemies pushed the case hard enough. The general who fell too high. General Liu Jianglong had been a hero. He defended the northern borders from Mongol raids, commanded over 30,000 men, and governed a province critical to the empire's security. He was respected by soldiers, feared by enemies, and, most dangerously, envied by bureaucrats in the capital. His downfall began with what should have been a minor supply dispute. Imperial officials accused him of misusing resources. His replies were direct, perhaps too direct, the voice of a soldier, not a courtier. Then came the fatal misstep. He bypassed the usual chains of communication and wrote directly to court officials about military strategy. In his letters, he criticized certain imperial appointees. That was all his enemies needed. A disputed order to transfer some of his forces was the breaking point. Lu believed the command was forged by rivals trying to weaken him. He delayed while seeking confirmation. In the capital, this was spun as outright defiance of the emperor. Soon, disobedience became treason, and rumors claimed Lu planned to create his own kingdom on the frontier. Whether true or not, the decision was made. The emperor, determined to make an example, ordered Lu's immediate arrest. The last journey, they brought him to the capital in a cage cart, the bars ensuring the crowd could study his face as he passed. Witnesses disagreed on what they saw. Some said he sat tall, his eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look away. Others swore there was resignation there, maybe even fear. The execution site was prepared with the same precision as a festival. Vendors sold food. Lucky charms were hawked to those who thought witnessing such an execution might taint their fortunes. Dignitaries had elevated seats. Commoners pressed against the front lines. The event was set for midday, the sun high, so that nothing would be hidden in shadow. When Lu was brought forward, the charges were read aloud for nearly an hour. Every accusation, every twist of his own words into evidence against him. Only then, with the crowd primed, was the general stripped and bound to the frame. The first cut was shallow, across his chest. Not enough to kill, not even enough to bleed much. It was a beginning, a signal to the crowd and a promise to the condemned. This will be long. And it was. They called it Lingqi, the death by 1,000 cuts. And for those who saw it, the memory never left. The first cut always draws a collective gasp, not because it is deep, but because it marks the moment when the ritual shifts from theater to reality. The master executioner, a man in his 50s with the calm of someone who has done this hundreds of times, wipes his blade clean and chooses another. His movements are unhurried, almost ceremonial. The knives are laid out on a small lacquer table, each one honed to a whisper-thin edge. He tests the sharpness by slicing through a strip of silk. The fabric falls away in silence. Lu does not flinch when the second cut comes. A small piece taken from his left forearm. The flesh is removed cleanly, like a butcher preparing a cut of meat. The executioner holds it up briefly for the assistants to deposit in a wooden bowl. The crowd murmurs. The next slices target fingers and toes. Extremities first. Always. A finger is taken at the joint. A toe follows. The bleeding is controlled with tourniquet-like straps and powders that sting the air with their bitter smell. The goal is not to weaken the general too quickly. His life is to be stretched thin, like the silk being cut, never torn. Anatomy of cruelty. Lingqi was not improvised. Every movement had a place in a sequence refined over centuries. The early cuts were about pain, not fatality. Fingertips, earlobes, the edge of the nose. The next phase moved inward, removing strips of flesh from the arms, calves, and thighs. The executioner knew exactly where to cut to produce the sharpest stings or the deepest throbs. Some wounds were designed to burn like fire for hours. Others were dull aches that crept through muscle and bone. By alternating them, the victim never had time to adjust. The crowd leaned forward, faces tight with fascination. Parents held their children higher, telling them in whispers that this was what awaited traitors. The air smelled of blood, sweat, and street food, the grotesque mixing with the ordinary. The soldiers' silence. For the first hour, Lu remained silent, his jaw set, eyes fixed ahead as though the crowd did not exist. This silence unnerved some spectators. They had expected begging, or at least screams, but the general's rigid bearing reminded them of his years in command. The executioner noticed too. He slowed his pace, drawing out the intervals between cuts to let anticipation gnaw at Lu's mind. The pauses were as much a weapon as the blades. When he moved to the face, beginning with shallow incisions along the jawline and near the eyes, the first break came. Lu's breathing quickened. His lips trembled. A cut at the corner of the mouth, designed to stretch into a grotesque smile. Drew a sharp inhale. Not quite a cry, but close. A crowd's hunger. The audience was part of the process. Their gasps, their jeers, even their silence fed the rhythm. Some called out suggestions, urging the executioner to take more from certain places. Vendors sold cups of wine, sticky sweets, and roasted duck skewers, while just feet away, strips of human flesh were being collected. A few bold spectators, or superstitious ones, paid for a piece, believing it had medicinal or magical properties. What should have been horror became commerce. The body falters. By midday, the cuts deepened. Lou's shoulders sagged. His knees trembled despite the restraints. Sweat ran in rivers down his chest, mixing with blood in a slick sheen. The executioner paused several times, signaling for water to be poured into Lou's mouth, keeping him from slipping into unconsciousness. Powder was pressed into certain wounds to stop the bleeding, the sting forcing his eyes wide open. The pace alternated, deliberate and slow, then suddenly swift when Lou's head began to droop. The executioner's years of experience allowed him to keep the general balanced at the edge of collapse, never tipping over too soon. Breaking the mind. The turning point came late in the afternoon. The executioner worked around the eyes, small, deliberate cuts that blurred Lou's vision with tears and blood. His lips parted, and this time the sound was audible. Some said it was a call to his ancestors. Others claimed it was a confession. Still others insisted it was a cry for mercy. Whatever it was, the crowd's excitement surged. Even endurance has its limits, and the moment those limits crack, the spectacle is complete. The next series of cuts worked into the muscle of the thighs and chest, each one taking more from the general's strength. His breathing grew ragged, his head slumped forward. The executioner quickened his hands now. The body was failing faster than planned, and the end was closing in. The sun was dipping lower now, its heat heavy in the air. Sweat darkened the executioner's robes, but his hands never trembled. For over 5 hours he had worked with the precision of a calligrapher, his blades tracing lines of pain instead of ink. But no matter the skill, no body could withstand this forever. Lou's skin had turned an ashen gray, his lips pale, his eyes glazed. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one sounding thinner than the last. The executioner recognized the signs: severe blood loss, the slow fading of nerve responses. He would need to move quickly to keep the crowd's attention before life slipped away completely. A frantic crescendo. The earlier slow, almost ceremonial pace gave way to a rapid series of cuts. The blades worked into the large muscle groups, thighs, shoulders, chest, areas where the flesh came away in thick red strips. Assistants kept the wounds from bleeding out too fast, pressing powders and heated irons to seal vessels just enough to prolong the moment. Lou's body jerked involuntarily at each strike, but the will that had held him upright was gone. His head hung forward, his hair matted with sweat and blood. Even the crowd sensed the end was near. The shouting quieted into a tense murmur. Children who had cheered earlier now clung to their parents. The last breath. Court physicians, seated to one side with their scrolls and ink, noted the time when Lou's color shifted again, from the gray of shock to the chalk white of final collapse. His breathing slowed to a whisper, then to a pause. Some witnesses claimed his final breath was accompanied by a faint smile, as though he had outlasted his enemies in spirit, if not in body. Others swore he died with his eyes open, staring at the executioner. The end was not dramatic. No cry, no speech, just stillness. The master executioner stepped back, lowered his blade, and bowed, not to Lou, but to the imperial officials seated above. The ritual was complete. Aftermath in the capital. The execution ground emptied slowly. Street vendors packed away their goods. Scribes rolled up their records to be stored in the imperial archives. The wooden frame, slick with blood, was dismantled and scrubbed clean for the next spectacle. But Lou's death did not vanish with the crowd. It traveled. Messengers carried the official account to every province. The emperor's judgment, the charges, the method of punishment. These reports were deliberately detailed, meant to lodge themselves in the minds of military commanders, governors, and anyone who might dare to defy imperial authority. The death of General Lou was not the end of the story. It was the start of something larger, a a reminder carved into memory of the empire of what happened when power feared its own guardians. But it was also a chapter in a much longer history of Ling Qi, a practice that had not sprung from cruelty alone, but from a centuries-old blend of politics, philosophy, and ritualized violence, a system of fear. By the late Ming era, Ling Qi had already been shaped into a weapon of governance. It was never about killing. It was about display, about showing the empire, from farmers to generals, that the Son of Heaven's will was absolute, the law placed at the pinnacle of punishment, above beheading, above hanging, above any swift death. Only crimes that disrupted the cosmic order warranted such an end: treason, rebellion, patricide, certain sorceries. Confucian doctrine gave the practice moral cover. The emperor was the keystone between heaven and earth. To attack him, directly or indirectly, was to fracture the balance of the universe. And if the cosmos had been disrupted, only something equally extraordinary, something that burned itself into the memory of all who witnessed it, could restore harmony. Philosophy as a blade. Confucian scholars wrote essays defending the punishment. Buddhist interpretations suggested such extreme suffering might purge karmic debts, preparing the soul for a better rebirth. To the common person, these were not abstract theories. They were part of the air they breathed, beliefs that made the spectacle not just acceptable, but necessary. Watching Ling Qi was, in their eyes, witnessing the rebalancing of the moral order. Foreign missionaries, arriving centuries later, were horrified. To them, this was state-sanctioned sadism dressed in ceremonial robes. Their writings would shape how the outside world remembered the practice, stripped of its philosophical justifications, shown only as the barbarity it truly was. The machine refined. Following Lu's death, Ling Qi became even more systematized. Protocols were drafted to ensure uniformity. How many cuts, where they should be placed, how the condemned should be restrained. Official scribes recorded each stage with clinical detachment, as though chronicling an engineering process rather than a human death. The goal was consistency, but the result was something darker, a bureaucracy of cruelty. Records from the decades after Lu's execution show a steep rise in its use, sometimes for crimes far below the level of treason. Once the machine was built, it became easier to turn its gears. The slow death of practice. By the 19th century, however, cracks began to form. China faced increasing foreign pressure, military defeats, unequal treaties, humiliations at the hands of Western powers. To these outsiders, Ling Qi was proof of Chinese backwardness, a convenient image to justify intervention. Inside the empire, reform-minded officials began to see the practice as a liability. It might inspire fear at home, but it fed propaganda abroad. The Qing dynasty, the last imperial rulers of China, finally abolished Ling Qi in 1905, less than a decade before their own collapse. Officially, the move was framed as a modernization of law. Unofficially, it was an admission that the age of public, ceremonial cruelty had passed, a shadow that remains. Yet the shadow of Ling Qi lingers. It appears in history books as one of the most infamous punishments ever devised. It survives in photographs from the final decades of its use, grim, grainy images that shocked the early 20th century world. And it survives in the way we think about state power, the spectacle of punishment, the performance of authority, the belief that fear can hold society together. These are not relics of China's past. They are temptations every government in every age must resist. The physical brutality of Ling Qi is easy to describe. The harder part, the part that forces us to look in a mirror, is understanding how an entire society can not only accept it, but believe in it. Ritualizing the unthinkable. Violence, when stripped bare, invites revulsion. But the Ming and later Qing courts wrapped Ling Qi in layers of ritual, symbolism, and philosophy. By doing so, they transformed it from raw cruelty into what they framed as justice. The executioner became an agent of cosmic balance, the scribe a historian of moral order, the crowd witnesses to harmony being restored. In this way, the unimaginable became routine, the science of suffering. Executioners were not brutes swinging blades in frenzy. They were trained, disciplined, and deeply knowledgeable about human anatomy. They knew which nerves to strike, which veins to avoid, how to control bleeding, so the condemned would linger at the edge of life for as long as possible. They could read breathing patterns, skin color, muscle tremors, adjusting the pace to keep the victim conscious. Trapped in a carefully crafted nightmare, they had turned cruelty into a science, the crowd as participant. And then there was the audience. Spectators were not passive. They shouted. They jeered. Some paid for scraps of the condemned's flesh, believing it held medicinal or magical power. Fear kept them obedient, but curiosity kept them watching. In a way, they were just as essential to the performance as the executioner. Without witnesses, Lingqi lost its power as a warning. It wasn't only the victim being disciplined. It was everyone watching. The moral paradox. Here lies a paradox that has haunted historians ever since. China, for centuries, was a civilization that produced profound works of philosophy, breathtaking art, and scientific innovations ahead of its time. And yet, it could also perfect a method of slow, deliberate death. This is not uniquely Chinese. History shows that any society, under the right conditions, absolute power, deep social hierarchy, and an unquestioned belief in the necessity of order, can sanctify violence if it serves its goals. Lessons that refuse to fade. Modern human rights advocates often point to Lingqi as an example of what happens when justice becomes performance and punishment becomes theater. The details differ, but the underlying logic survives in other eras and other places. Public shaming in the digital age. State executions designed for television coverage. Laws crafted to be as humiliating as they are punitive. The same psychological levers are being pulled. Only the tools have changed. The execution of General Liu Zhenglong was supposed to be the perfect warning, an unforgettable reminder that no one, however loyal or accomplished, was beyond the reach of the emperor's blade. And in one sense, it worked. Word of his death by 1,000 cuts spread far beyond the capital, traveling along trade routes and whispered in taverns, until it reached even foreign courts. But the warning carried another unintended message. If loyalty and service could end in such a fate, then safety lay not in valor, but in invisibility. Fear is policy. Within the Ming court, the lesson was taken to heart. Generals curbed their ambitions, commanders avoided decisive action, and military leaders began prioritizing political survival over military success. For the empire's enemies, this was a gift. An army led by men too afraid to excel is an army already half defeated. The rot beneath the throne. Among the common people, the story took on a different flavor. For some, Liu's death was justice, a restoration of cosmic balance. For others, it was proof that the emperor's justice could be bent to serve fear and suspicion. That quiet doubt was dangerous. Once the belief in the ruler's fairness began to crack, it never truly healed. Lingqi's final days. By the late Qing dynasty, Lingqi had become infamous not only within China, but across the world. Foreign diplomats wrote reports dripping with horror. Missionaries sent letters describing the practice in detail, using it as proof of China's barbarity to their readers back home. In 1905, under intense internal and external pressure, the imperial government officially abolished the practice. But by then, its shadow had already stretched across centuries. The modern mirror. We no longer see men strapped to wooden frames in city squares. But the underlying machinery that allowed Lingqi to flourish, the ritualization of cruelty, the public spectacle of punishment, the belief that fear is the surest tool of governance, still exists in different forms. When a government makes an example out of someone to scare the rest, when justice is performed for the audience rather than the truth, the ghost of Lingqi is still watching. The lesson in the horror, the real danger of Lingqi was not the blade, but a belief that such cruelty was necessary. Once a society accepts that, it will always find new ways to dress up brutality in the language of order, duty, and harmony. General Liu Zhenglong is long dead. The empire that condemned him has crumbled into dust. But the questions his execution raises about loyalty, justice, and the limits of human endurance are as alive now as they were on that blindingly bright day in the capital. If there is any justice in remembering him, it is this, that the next time power tempts us to treat another's suffering as a warning to the crowd, we remember how easily that warning becomes a stain that centuries cannot wash away.